As above, so below.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I'm a psychiatrist. I study meaningful coincidences like synchronicity and serendipity. My book, Meaningful Coincidences, has been on sale since September of last year, and it describes the field as best as I could of meaningful coincidences. And if you hit the subscribe button underneath my finger here, that's going to help us get the word out. And our subscribers continue to go up, and it's really nice to see. We have some basic fans who keep coming back and some more that we seem to be attracting. And today we're going to be having what I think will be a very interesting discussion. We're going to be playing around on the interface between crazy and not crazy, between when is synchronicity not psychosis? When is it psychosis? When it's someplace in between? And this is an important message that Chris Mackey is going to be delivering to us. But first, one of my stories. This one's called The Curve to Nowhere. In 1971, while I was living in Redwood City, California, on the peninsula south of San Francisco, the quarterback for my Swarthmore College football team introduced me to a guy with a motorcycle who lived on Skyline Drive. Skyline Drive went across the top of some mountains that were between the San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. And it was a fun place to ride. So somehow I ended up on my BSA 500. That's an old motorcycle, but fast, chasing this guy on Skyline Drive, headed north towards San Francisco. Well, he knew the curvy road. I didn't. So he kind of disappeared off into the distance around the corners, and I went around a curve. And as I went around the curve, I kind of crossed the center line. And as I crossed the center line, there was another car coming around from the other direction. And I looked over to see the handlebar of my motorcycle miss the door of that car by about this far. We have near-death experiences where people actually almost die and come back. Well, I didn't die, but it was a near-death experience because I was only using a bicycle helmet. So you got to take risks sometimes. Sometimes you got to know which risks are good to take and which ones you got to be careful about. And somehow I got out of that one. As I mentioned, our guest today is Chris Mackey, a clinical and counseling psychologist and fellow of the Australian Psychological Society. He's been doing this clinical stuff for 43 years, and he's the boss of Chris Mackey and Associates in Geelong, Australia. Geelong, Australia. He's a member of the Coincidence Project board, and boy, does he help us out. Chris is the author of the book, The Positive Psychology of Synchronicity, Enhance Your Mental Health with the Power of Coincidence. He was the production psychologist to the 2022 Positive Psychology documentary film, How to Thrive. He is co-presenter of the mental health podcast, Psych, Spiels, and Silver Linings. Chris received the Impact Achievement Award at the 2019 Australian Allied Health Awards. He's a very active guy, looks low-key, but he gets a lot of stuff done. And maybe you'll be able to tell, maybe you won't, but this guy is a doer. He makes stuff happen. And one of the most important things he's got for us as an audience, and not just us listening, but people you know, is making the distinction between a synchronicity that's within the normal limits and a set of synchronicities that may indicate that somebody is crazy, psychotic, and as we may talk about, sometimes you can be somewhat manic and be diagnosed as manic, but you still are experiencing meaningful coincidences that might even help you out of your problems. And we got a lot to talk about. And Chris, please tell us a coincidence story.
Okay, and thanks very much for having me on, Bernie, and especially at such a civilised hour for Australian time. We're often meeting in the middle of the night for me with the Coincidence Project, which is wonderful, but yeah, delightful to join you here today. Okay, if I start off with a story that puts a context to this, this was such a striking coincidence to me because it was so affirming. And it relates to a context about 18 years ago where I faced a constellation of wicked problems, some of the most challenging problems I'd encountered in my life. They were related to my mother becoming sick and dying, and I knew that there'd be all sorts of complications potentially at a family level, including in how different executor matters were handled. And I can't go right into that story because it's quite a personal story. But there were wicked problems. There were also complications in my work where a psychologist had just resigned under difficult circumstances, and so I had extra work demands on at a time when I wanted to take a lot of time off from work because I knew that my mother might not have long to live. She had an advanced form of cancer. Well, through one thing and another, facing these wicked problems, the only way I thought I could handle it was to draw on synchronicity. And in the past, in my early adult life, from when I experienced synchronicity from my mid-20s, often I noticed I experienced more synchronicity if I was in a heightened state of arousal, which I would call a hypomanic-like state. And so I thought that the only way I was going to deal with these problems was going to be if I were to evoke such a state again and experiencing a lot of synchronicity that might help me solve problems, because synchronicity had in the past. Now, I didn't want to take this too far, and the way I thought of it in my mind is I wanted to shift my brain chemistry in a certain direction, almost a metaphor of having endogenous amphetamines, so a hypomanic-like process, but I wanted to do a Daedalus rather than do an Icarus. I didn't want to fly too high and too close to the sun. I wanted to do what many people forgot happened with Daedalus. He successfully was able to fly and come back to Earth, but from not going too high. So I call it a hypomanic-like process, but I do believe it involves some shift in my brain chemistry, where I allowed myself to be more busy, get more fluid and creative in my thinking, follow my intuition further, tapping into a certain kind of state that I've been somewhat familiar with a few times in the past, but usually under times of great stress. Now, what was happening is that all sorts of coincidences that were happening over a period of weeks, dozens of them over a period of 2 months, I'd say 200 or 300 coincidences, some of them profound. And I thought, my gosh, this experiment I'm doing of switching on this process and later on seeing if I can switch it off is really paying off for me. But some people were thinking that maybe I was going a bit loose in my thinking. Many didn't. Many friends and colleagues who knew me saw me as maybe saying some strange things at the time, but basically functioning well. But a number of people, including my wife and some close friends, were concerned about how I was going. And I thought, I'm going to do a little experiment here one day when I'm going for a jog. I thought, I'm going to stop the next person I encounter, and I'm going to ask them straight out if they experience synchronicity. And if they do, then that's a little bit affirming. So I'm running along about another few hundred meters, and I was relieved to see a fellow I'd never spoken to, but I'd seen him 2 or 3 times a week over recent years. He'd be walking while I was jogging past in an opposite direction. He was doing some exercises on a sea wall. I walked up to him, stopped, and I said, look, this might be a very strange question to ask you. I've seen you walking while I jog, and I hope it's okay if I can ask you. Just to mention, there was this fellow many years ago called Carl Jung, a psychiatrist, who talked about synchronicity, meaningful coincidences. Have you ever experienced meaningful coincidences? I was a bit relieved because he didn't immediately dismiss me as crazy. He stopped, he scratched his chin, he looked up, and he said, many years ago in Melbourne, there was a department store that started called Daimaru. He said, I said that was going to last 10 years before it wound up. Not 9, not 11, 10 years. It lasted 10 years. I thought, this is really interesting. He's telling me about precognition. That's interesting straight off. And then I was about to jog on after it took a little bit more. And then he said, oh, there was this other thing as well. Years ago, my father was going to go into a nursing home. And I thought, no, don't sell your house and go into a nursing home. He thought, my father is going to die in 3 weeks' time. Well, there was nothing medically suggesting that would happen. It was a strange thought, but he acted on it because he believed in it. He convinced his father not to go into the nursing home. Well, when I was going on that jog, and part of the wicked problems I was facing was around my mother's impending death. And I was wondering, for different reasons, how long she might have to live. It would make a major difference to a number of decisions I had to make. Immediately after he told me that story, I thought, my mother will have 3 weeks to live. I went back home, told my wife, my mother will have 3 weeks to live. My wife, who was an ICU nurse and teacher in the past, said that would defy medical credibility. I never even asked the medical staff, as relevant as it would have been for any kind of prognosis. I felt I knew the answer. My mother died within about 3 weeks. Now, amongst the hundreds of other coincidences of the time, and dare I say, some of the advantage of having that intuitive awareness that I could plan around, it made a big practical difference at the time. It's an example of how synchronicity practically helped me. But to me, that was a seminal experience where I looked to test out the hypothesis about whether many more people experienced this than talked about it, because they feared people would think that they were crazy or weird. And I thought, well, experiment, I can tick off that experiment. It supported the notion more people do experience it, but it also solved or helped me address one of the biggest problems I had at the time, or at least helped me plan for some of those problems.
Yeah, one of the among the amazing things you just described, Chris, was that you made yourself create endogenous amphetamines, perhaps dopamine, norepinephrine, that you could do that volitionally. As a psychiatrist who's interested in the mind and the brain, as I am, one of the unspoken lessons that any kind of psychoactive drug can do with somebody is teach them how they can get to a certain state of mind without having to use the drug. It gets them to that state of mind. How did you do that? How did you make yourself hypomanic? How did you do that?
Okay, now I'll give a little bit of a background context to this too, because it all relates. When my mother was on her deathbed, I thought, I want to give her something that she would value. What can I give her? And I remember that she used to tell me this crazy story. She used to say to me how her grandmother said how someone in our family would be famous. And so I thought, this is very strange. But on my mother's deathbed, I basically said to her, look, Mum, you used to say how Gran Harris used to say someone in our family would be famous. She said, yes. I said, Mum, I think that's me. And she said, you got it. Now, I'm play acting at this time. I think this is a ridiculous kind of thought to have. But anyway, I thought, well, I'm going to tell my mum that I've made up these theories that help account for change in people's minds and psychological theories. And I'd been toying with the idea of positive psychiatry. There's the field of positive psychology, which we look at optimistic ways of adjusting our mindset. Well, I think there should be a field of positive psychiatry where we also look at placebo effects and how we can change our brain chemistry. And a basic background of that is when I was severely depressed as a 20-year-old, I had 8 months of therapy and was glad to see a psychiatrist at first who decided not to prescribe medication for me, even though I was severely depressed. And I recovered from that depression fully without medication. So that said to me, some things can change your brain chemistry without medication. 10 years later, I had a second depression for all sorts of different kind of complicated reasons, hospital politics, things like that. Well, for a period of time, I was on the highest dose of medication of antidepressants you could be, prothidin and a mix of other things, and it wasn't touching the sides. Dealing with my perfectionism and other things, I just wasn't getting well at first until I saw a wonderful therapist who used a 2-chair technique with me, and I left that session thinking, I want to become undepressed and never be depressed again another day in my life. That was 30 years ago, never depressed again another day in my life. That fully resolved. So I'd already had experiences that showed that we could change our brain chemistry without medication. And when I reflected on this hypomanic thing, which at first I hadn't really thought of, but it tweaked for me at a certain time to the point where I told colleagues in a psychology meeting, in a supervision meeting, hey, I think there've been times in the past when, for example, under the pressure of exams and I had many different demands, I think I deliberately induced a hypomanic-like state, meaning kind of like endogenous amphetamines, which I've never taken, by the way. I've never taken illicit drugs, quite frankly. But so as far as that, I already had the kind of experience. But I told my colleagues that, and I thought, why did I say this strange thing to my colleagues in a meeting? I thought, because I'll never have to use that strategy again. Things are so settled and stable at work, and I'm of a certain age. Well, it was within days that I learned that my mother was terminally ill and I had this other complication at work. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've just thought I'll never have to use this method again, but I will have to use this method again. So I felt that I intuitively had an idea of what I needed to do, which is becoming more fluid in my thinking, allow myself to have less sleep. I know I can get by on less sleep at times, which is why I can turn up to these meetings at 2 o'clock in the morning and have enough sleep that night. But so basically I had that background plus another background. For the previous 20 years or so, about every month or two, I'd met with a mentor who told me synchronicity stories, an older family friend who was very wise. And every time we met, he had amazing stories. And I felt like I was a student and I had like a shaman mentor for synchronicity. And so I had a lot of background and I thought, I'm never going to be able to trust in or use synchronicity like he does. But this constellation of problems led me to think, I'll back myself. So basically, there was this way I knew I could switch the mechanism on, and all this synchronicity followed, much of it very fortuitous and helpful. These wicked problems were uncannily resolved. I wasn't actually surprised by that. I was left with the challenge of how I would turn off the process, which will come up later. But at that stage, I not only believed that we could create different chemicals in our brain on the basis of if we've got receptors for antidepressant medication or antipsychotic medication or amphetamines, they must have been there in the first place. They weren't designed for the drug companies to suddenly come up with a drug and then you use those receptors. We must have had an internal endogenous version of the very same chemicals. All those receptors being there would make no sense. Well, I thought, well, I'm going to use those receptors. I'm going to use those chemicals and I'm going to use those receptors. And I added the notion in telling my mother a story. So I wanted to embellish it a bit. I said, oh, not only can we produce new chemicals in our brain, different chemicals that mimic all sorts of drugs that exist, but also we can make our receptors open and close. Because I also had this internal meditation. I was not only producing the endogenous amphetamines, but opening up the receptors almost like a flower that would receive them. So later on, I could dial down the endogenous amphetamines and close the receptors, and that would reverse the process. Didn't know how I was going to do that, excuse me, but that was the theory I had behind it long before I knew that there was such a thing as receptors opening or closing.
That's that's pretty amazing, Chris. What you seem to have described is that you imagined endogenous amphetamine, you imagined receptors opening and closing, and you can increase the number of receptors, which is part of what you were implying, and you can reduce the number of receptors. That does happen under varying circumstances, and you can increase the release of dopamine and norepinephrine from the vesicles that they're held in the presynaptic areas. And somehow you did that. You had a model for it that was good enough to be able to make that happen. Now, what?
Yes.
You know, and you don't know. And I think that we can stop it here. I mean, we've talked about the idea of this being, excuse me, this being about psychosis versus something normal. But this is so crucial, an idea of voluntarily changing your brain biochemistry without any other chemicals, just doing it consciously.
Yeah.
And you were able to do that. That's pretty amazing, Chris. That's pretty amazing.
One of the things that intrigues me, and I started reflecting on at the time, and actually my brother-in-law gave me a book, Shaman. And reading up on that book, I thought, well, that's every culture has its shamans. That's all they had to go on. Internal ways of changing brain chemistry, which is where they had the weird headdresses and the strange facial expressions and the music and the drumming and all the rest of it to help people get in a different frame of mind. So all the shamans in every culture, in a sense, understood this. But what I was doing is not actually starting off from some kind of scientific deduction. It was partly experiential. But the main thing I'm wanting to do is to tell my mum a story, and she's lying back in bed nodding. Very interesting, Chris. I'm thinking, great, this is working. I'll keep on making this stuff up. And after a while, I thought, hey, wait a minute, this is actually happening. This is actually true. How spooky is that? I thought, well, synchronicity.
Well, it's your mother inspired you toward the end of her life. And this is, I'm going to move us off of this subject because I think we've made the point without knowing, again, without knowing how we do it. And placebo response is, rather than placebo effect, is as a way to say it, that you respond to the pill in the way that you want to be able to respond. And there is a placebo response, and you were able to do that, and you need to be studied. But the important thing for our discussion here is that some people thought you was nuts. Some people thought you were hypomanic. And I think you were even put in the hospital, you volunteered because they were pushing you to go into the hospital. And why don't you tell us about how you looked on the borderline between maybe crazy, maybe not, maybe hypomanic, maybe not. And because that's what the point of, I think, your main message is.
Yes, and I didn't go into hospital, and I certainly really would have been annoyed if I was pressured to go into hospital, and I had a way, fortunately, of avoiding that, which many people might find more difficult. But okay, here's another strange thing. Some way into this process, a friend visited. I didn't know this friend was visiting, but this friend happened to be a very bright psychologist friend I've known for a long time, and also an Australasian expert in bipolar disorder. Now, as far as I knew, it's just that my friend turned up by chance, but it could have been that my wife was concerned about how I was going, and that might have led to that, which I've subsequently believe is more true. My wife was concerned, but to me, it was just by chance my friend was visiting. There's another strange thing that was happening at that time my friend was visiting, which is I had a major problem of a renovation of our main work building where I'm speaking from now. And so I lined up this builder who we'd had this major conflict with 2 years earlier. And I got in touch with him and looked to meet him on this particular evening because I thought, look, strangely, despite all this potential animosity that could have been between us from a deal that fell through a couple of years ago, I just felt that he was the person to contact about our problem of not getting a builder for our workhouse. Anyway, my psychologist friend visiting knew of that story. And when she heard that I was going to meet with that builder who she anticipated I'd have a major conflict with, she thought I was partly going nuts for that. Why would you meet with that person that's not going to turn out well? I said, I'm so glad you're here because you're a scientist by heart and in your mind. I'd like to do an experiment now. It's called applying quantum physics for business advantage, meaning I was looking to draw on synchronicity to have some business benefit. Anyway, I went off to meet the builder, and my friend would have thought I was nuts. I took about an hour and a half before I came back, and my friend and my wife probably thought I'd gone off to drown myself in Corio Bay, but no, I did turn up. They said, "What happened?" I said, "The builder, he's going to build the building, and he's going to build it at cost. He's going to start in 3 weeks." Now, at first, they were really surprised by that. But afterwards in the evening, I noticed that my psychologist friend again was being more wary, and I could tell that she thought I was maybe a bit nuts, being a bit grandiose. And I thought, well, I've probably just saved myself $40,000, which we had. I thought that would be evidence in itself that maybe that little experiment paid off. But okay, it wasn't so convincing to my friend at the time. And we're having this conversation, and partway through this conversation, I have this sudden thought that your frame, meaning your perspective, your frame of reference, is broken or flawed. Your frame, your way of looking at me is flawed. When the word your frame, which is a strange word to come into my mind, I wouldn't normally have had the word frame rather than framework or whatever, your frame. She was sitting in a wooden frame chair, and the back frame, the backrest of the chair cracked through. At the exact second, I had the thought of the word frame. I thought, whoa, this is weird. My friend who was very slightly built, the back of the chair's cracked through. And I thought, this is just amazing. I thought, this has got to be a thing. This has got to be some kind of phenomenon that must be recognized. But I just had that in the back of my mind. A few years later, I saw a movie called The Dangerous Method, a dangerous method about Freud and psychoanalysis. And it had this particular scene in the movie where Jung and Freud were having a major argument. And at a key point of the argument, there was this crack in the furniture next to Freud and Jung. It might have been a big cupboard or something like that.
It's a bookcase. It was a bookcase.
Bookcase, okay, bookcase, this crack. And I learned later that Jung used a term for that, the catalytic exteriorization phenomenon. So where your mind connects with something happening in the material world. And I thought, how striking is there's me with a psychologist friend thinking I'm nuts. And that's the moment that the chair cracks, which I felt extraordinarily affirming for my good mental health. I thought, here's another bit of evidence here, because I'm collecting evidence the whole time, anecdotal evidence, but these are striking things that you can't demonstrate in double-blind trials or whatever, but pretty convincing evidence to me. And so, look, I'll just mention there's a little footnote to this story. 18 years after these things happened, and through the Coincidence Project, there's on the YouTube channel where I do a talk about synchronistic experience, enlightenment or psychosis. I tell that story. 1 week later, for the first time in 18 years, unexpected to me, that same friend visited. Not only did the same friend visit, the psychologist friend, and we were able to talk about those experiences years earlier, but she had the closest example of the cluster of wicked problems she was facing in her life now, with all sorts of potential legal and executive issues. The closest thing I've encountered in my life to anyone else having the wicked problems that I had 18 years earlier. So just that symmetry, again, 18 years later, she visits, we can have a further understanding of this. She's facing the same problems, which, dare I say, she's approaching in more conventional ways than I did. And I hope they work out for her. But for me, they worked out miraculously. And for 18 years since, worked out miraculously, reflected in my very positive relationship with my siblings and other kind of things like that. But I just thought that this is an example of how one type of coincidence can connect with another, and stories can unfold over decades in different ways. And to me, that was very affirming to be able to have a conversation with my friend about how often synchronistic experience, or this deep intuitive experience, is misunderstood, can be seen for psychosis. But what happened is, when a few friends did try and convince me to go into hospital, I said to them, look, tell you what, if I don't sleep well tonight, then I will volunteer to see a psychiatrist. Not necessarily go into hospital, but I'll see a psychiatrist. But rather than choose to see a psychiatrist who they were nominating that I see that night, and I thought how weird and unethical that was to try and pressure me into that situation when they didn't really understand what I was going through at all anyway. And it was so hard to explain to them. How do you explain this stuff to medically trained skeptics? But I said, okay, if I don't sleep well tonight, I'll go and see this other psychiatrist. And I nominated someone who they knew themselves had diametrically opposed views to me on all sorts of things. I wanted them to be conscious on what they're asking me to do, to subject myself and my well-being and my brain chemistry to their appointment of someone who would have opposite philosophical and health-related beliefs to me, and who they would be looking to empower to use very powerful medication against my will to suppress my ways of operating that they thought weren't acceptable. And I'll just mention as an aside, I think this is a different kind of neurodiversity. We talk about neurodiversity in terms of ADHD or autism spectrum or whatever. I'm a very neurotypical person, but for this brief period of time, I was acting in a very neurodiverse way, and it was kind of bipolar-like. And then the big question was whether I was going to be able to turn it off. But that night I slept like a baby because all my wicked problems had been resolved, and I knew I would have a very peaceful sleep, and it was one of the best sleeps I would have had the last 20 years.
Well, you exemplify by your stories here the borderland between psychosis or useful synchronicities. Because you operationalized your synchronicities, you made them work for you, and when you're manic, it reflects a very basic idea of meaningful coincidences, that the more thoughts you have, the more potential you have for those thoughts to match something in your environment. Similarly, if you're in a rich environment with lots of stuff going on, you're more likely to find a thought matching something in the environment. All of that can be done too much, of course. So how do people watching and listening to you help themselves and help loved ones differentiate between whether they're crazy, whether they're psychotic, or whether they're using meaningful coincidences in a constructive way?
Okay, well, I think that the more that someone does something unconventional, the more you have to back that up also with a degree of rationality and mainstream understanding. So, and I'll just mention as an aside, I've been interested in synchronicity from my early 20s, starting off as an absolute skeptic. However, experience has led me, I'd say, that my karma ran over my dogma, is how I put it. And after that, I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to follow my own underlying beliefs, I'm going to do a lot of research, and we do a lot of outcome data. Again, in a month's time, there'll be a paper presented. I'm a co-author on that, which is about outcome data across psychology practices in Australia. We're one of 4 practices identified in Australia that's collected this outcome data on thousands of people. We were the only practice 10 years ago recognised for doing that as an independent private practice. So I've always been very mainstream oriented. I've presented at scientific conferences for 25 years, often on outcome evaluation for trauma and anxiety, depression. So I work in a very conventional way. And in this particular phase too, I was connecting in with about 8 different psychologist friends myself, including several people at work that I had quite open conversations with, a couple of friends outside of work. So I had a number of checks and balances. My biggest check and balance was whether the synchronicity worked, whether it was paying off. And spookily for me, almost in a very challenging way for me, it said, keep on going, keep on going. I think, like, really? This is starting to get pretty weird, but keep on going, keep on going. I did have an underlying belief, but I also was committing myself to follow through with synchronicity if it was working. So I would say it's very important for people also to have a spiritual friend or spiritual friends. Like, I had lots of contact with psychologist friends as well to reflect on my mental state at the time and check how that was going. But also I've had spiritual friends like my mentor. And my mentor was one who I visited during that phase. And I knew that he was questioning my mental health himself. Now, he would have heard things from others that would have led him to be more concerned as well. But even so, I took that seriously, that he was questioning that. But also I was experiencing so much synchronicity that I thought that outweighed his skepticism, as well as some affirming things that other people who knew me. But this is going to sound weird. One of the ways that I gauged also my mental functioning is I felt that there was absolute meaning in certain songs from Pearl Jam. One was called Off He Goes, one was called Man of the Hour, and one was called Wish List. And when I heard the lyrics to Off He Goes for about the first time, I thought, there's something about this song that's going to tell me where I'm at in terms of this hypomanic-like process. And it was uncanny. I didn't know the lyrics of the song at that stage. And it talks about this person who's riding fast, riding too fast on a motorbike. I think, whoa, this is saying I might be going too far. And then later on in the song, it says, but he's back again, and he's the same friend we've always known. I'm thinking, yeah, that's saying, look, I will be okay in the long run. You know, that's okay. And the end of the song, it's like, there was a strange creeping, as though, oh, there might be something going off kilter again. So I thought, I'm going to be really careful with this. And the Man of the Hour song I took to mean I had a project I was working on at the time, which was partly helping my mother die well, lots of other things around it. I thought, this is just for a time-limited thing, Man of the Hour, just for a limited time. And just before I met my friends that evening who were trying to get me to see a psychiatrist, I had a sense something might be up. So I thought, I'm going to do a circuit of the botanical gardens and play Man of the Hour, which for me was like a mindfulness calming thing, as Off He Goes was. The Pearl Jam songs I could use to get me up a bit or to manage me down. I was managing my brain chemistry partly through that. Halfway through this walk, this circuit, I thought, I know exactly what's going to happen. I didn't change my pace, but exactly when I finished that circuit, that's the exact second the song stopped. And I thought, I knew that would happen. And I felt so fortified when I returned home and soon after faced those friends. So I could have had 100 people lined up and with whatever qualifications saying, you know, Chris, you're crazy. But I felt so affirmed from what had happened for 2 months, including that Man of the Hour song and look, dozens of other things. And some people did say affirming things to me, that I felt so fortified I could withstand anything. And the question was whether I wasn't going to be able to get back to normal.
So I think your advice to people in the audience is one way to check out whether you're psychotic or not is if the synchronicities actually produce a positive result.
Yes. I'm a CBT person at heart, cognitive behavioral therapy. I believe in objective data. I believe in testing out our hypotheses. And so that's where I think it's unfortunate that many people in the mental health field, a priori, right from the start, they've thought anything that sounds intuitive is wrong. Anything that you can't explain in rational terms is wrong. And even Einstein acknowledged that there's a whole spiritual dimension to life. And so I think he said that science without religion is blind, something along those lines. So I think it's important to be rational and objective in certain ways, but I think what's often missing is being open to the more intuitive side, what I'd call intellectual intuition. But yes, whatever approach we have, it's worth checking out whether it works. Because if it's not working and we're just making excuses for that or making it up, we're probably getting caught up in denial or avoidance or fantasy. And there is an element of, well, there's an element of fantasy to interpreting synchronicity in the first place. And some of that is good. It's that intellectual intuition that it draws on. But I think that does put an extra onus to also check rationally whether what we're doing seems to be paying off, which to me is using our left brain and right brain together. Left brain, very rational, verbal. This is more a right brain, intuitive, creative process.
And you're saying one of the most important things about synchronicity is to be able to find a balance between your intuitive and your rational analyses of synchronistic events. So what are some questions that mental health professionals can use to help differentiate between valid synchronistic or transpersonal experiences and psychosis, Chris?
Okay, well, one of the first things is certainly it's fair enough to check whether the person seems to be displaying signs or behaviours that are consistent with some recognized mental disorder. And so it's fair enough to look at that. So it'd be fair enough for people to look, for example, at my behavior and see whether it fitted some kind of bipolar or hypomanic pattern, which, funnily enough, I checked with colleagues in different ways quite objectively. I was asking for feedback on how they thought about that. And it would have been around the borderline of a hypomanic episode, perhaps tipping just into that potentially on the face of it. But in addition, it's important for us to understand something about people's spiritual beliefs, including pre-existing spiritual beliefs. Because if a health professional, even a skeptic, had asked me something about what I was currently doing at the time, how I understood what was going on, I could have explained long-held beliefs that hadn't changed, that I was adhering to. I hadn't suddenly gone from being a mainstream normal guy who collects outcome data to flipping his lid and there's no rationality at all. Still, the rationality was running through in what I was doing. I could account in my terms for what I was doing. And so I think it really helps if at least a number of health professionals also inform themselves to an extra degree in, well, first of all, different kind of spiritual approaches to understanding life, because so much of our mental health services, it does well to get to mind-body connections sometimes, but how about mind, body, and soul? There's a lot missed out of soul. And if all these cultures had shamans who a lot of what they were doing was expressed at a spiritual or soul kind of level, well, we're really missing something if we don't grasp some of that. So we need health professionals, and certainly quite a number of health professionals, to try and get their head around the spiritual or soul dimension in life, because there's so much objective evidence that if people relate to a spiritual dimension in life, that's good for their mental health. So I'm not particularly religious, but I'm one of those 25% of Westerners who'd identify with being spiritual but not religious. So I think that if mental health professionals don't relate to a spiritual side in life, they ought to disqualify themselves from doing such assessments in the first place and looking for colleagues with some fluency or literacy, first of all, in spiritual phenomena and how they can relate to mental health, but also be open to that person's story. And then you look at how things are working. You look at some kind of objective evidence. So if I met with a builder and made a lousy decision and it cost $40,000, which in those days was a fair bit of money, still is, then that's a sign of something going poorly. But if I meet with someone and it leads to a benefit of a similar amount, well, don't be too quick to write that off as illness, or write that off as some kind of disease process, or write that off as pathology. So, and I think the challenge is to put all these things in a context, because it's so difficult to explain. We can explain, I can tell you stories, Bernie, because you're open to it and you invite me to be able to say some of these connections, and a number of things could be somewhat, some background interest assumed, but in many situations it's not like that. And if people are talking in very skeptical settings, it's hard to look objectively at the data of whether things are working well or not. But consider the person's history, their prior beliefs. See if you can meet with one or two people, if you're a health professional, who know that person well, who relates to their previous spiritual beliefs as well, to see whether that person might be acting consistently with their past known self, or if there's been some sudden kind of change, because some sudden change would seem to be more likely a sign of chaos or instability. But if people can give some meaningful account of what they're trying to do, even if the person's skeptical about what you're trying to draw on synchronicity to help solve problems, will at least be open to finding out how that's worked in the past or why the person thinks that might be helpful. But in the long run, I think it's going to be important that there are a number of, dare I say, more specialised mental health professionals who take a particular interest in this kind of area, who look at cross-cultural studies and who open themselves to realising that every culture across time has had an interest in satori, like Enlightenment experience, that on the surface can look like mania. And so I think that's the thing, that the health professionals should be open and rational as well, and maybe broaden their field of inquiry.
And as you talk about broadening the field of inquiry, I think one of the things that you're implying is that health professionals, mental health professionals in particular, should understand a spiritual approach to this reality. And so could you, from a clinical mental health perspective, define what you mean, or talk about what you mean by spiritual?
Now, spiritual covers such a range of experiences that we relate to from a more secular way of looking at spiritualities, having a sense of purpose or meaning in life. So in the positive psychology field, Ken Pargerman talks about sacred moments. And I like the notion of sacred, and I think we could often say that different forms of synchronicity are sacred moments. Like that fellow, when he said to me, oh, that's right, the fellow said about Daimaru and anticipating his father's death, he said, oh, my wife and I have this expression, the Lord's timing. The Lord's timing, what a delightful expression for synchronicity. It suggests the benevolent aspect of it. If I had an experiment to see if someone might be open to synchronicity, there it was there. Now, just the fact that he used the expression the Lord's timing, that suggests some spiritual beliefs, maybe with a religious element of it as well. But also, as Ken Pargerman described, if we see our work as a calling, that's spiritual. If we feel that we're in a relationship which is meant to be, that's spiritual. Or if we feel a particular deep connection with other people, so we're not just separated from them, we're connected in some way, that's spiritual. But spirituality also incorporates all sorts of mainstream beliefs. Sadly, that can get out of balance too, can't it? Like what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. It's frightening sometimes what can happen when people adhere so strongly to some spiritual beliefs that theirs are right and others are wrong, and things like that. But certainly there's spiritual beliefs, but many Christian beliefs, like the Virgin Mary being a virgin. Like there's a hell of a lot of beliefs that many mainstream people have through their Christian faith that we could consider to be quite delusional, and yet we don't assume people are psychotic that way. So anything which relates to religion, anything which relates to sacred experience, a soul level in life. We could even say certain music that has a soul to it. The deep beat of drums, we could say, is spiritual in different ways. Something which moves us at a very deep level, we could say. So there's a very wide range of experiences that are spiritual, but some of them also are associated with an altered state of consciousness, or what might be referred to liminal states. I think that's called bardo in some cultures, or satori. But another way it came up in Greek culture, they talked about people having a daimon, meaning your purpose. Sounds like demon, but your daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N, that's your purpose in life. Or the Romans talked of genius, having a seed in you that looks to grow. So for me, for example, that seed, what I'm looking to grow is the intersection between mental health and transformative processes. I'm interested mainly in mental health area, work as a psychologist, but also what tends to have a transformational or transcendent quality, because it's good to look at incremental change and improving our habits and things like that, like a lot of behavior therapy does that I relate to. But I think that some ways of influencing things that happen in our lives can be more transformative. I've given some examples here today. Now, I think those transformative kind of things, if they can work at an individual level in life, can they also work at a global level, which is what we're trying to do with the Coincidence Project. We get like-minded people together to look to contemplate similar things, work together to, if you like, look to spread the word, influence others about different ways of processing things, different kinds of human technologies we could talk about. And so I think that we've really underestimated the power of mind-body connections, and we've especially underestimated the power of mind-body-soul connections. So just like the shamans used to highlight all those years ago, but with the technologies that we've got now, including the wonders in psychiatry of being able to, like assess people's brain chemistry and understand that further, if we draw on more of that technology to understand more of those basic processes that went with shamanism that relate to a certain kind of spirituality and the altered states that can occur with it, I think that having more understanding about those phenomena will really help us look for furthering our positive mental health as well as addressing mental illness.
What you say is so important, is to know what the worldview of the patient is and how a synchronicity can fit within it. And it can be transformative, as you were implying. How do you, when you talk with your clients, your mental health people, how do you address synchronicity with them?
Okay, now one of the main things is I don't tend to bring it up very directly. Unfortunately, I don't need to, because I still work as very much a mainstream psychologist. My background is cognitive behavioral therapy. I suppose some of my postgraduate training was in psychodynamic therapy, and over 40 years have drawn on very different methods. But I really like some of the principles of cognitive therapy. It's our view of the world that really counts, also our experience. So you look at the cognitive, the behavioral, to look to shift our emotions. And sorry, Bernie, I just got a little bit lost then as well. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, sometimes your clients bring in synchronistic events, and we're asking about how you deal with them when they come up.
Thanks for that. Look, fortunately, people know of my interest in synchronicity now because I wrote a book about it. And actually, funny enough, one of the stories I have in the book is when a client came in one day and says, "Do you believe in synchronicity?" I said, "Yeah, actually, at the moment, I'm writing a book about it." We both laughed, and he gave me this profound story that was quite remarkable. And some of his recovery from 20 years of traumatic grief was synchronistic. But so to me, I think it's important not just to impose my interest on other people in different ways, but at times people will say things that point to certain kinds of spiritual beliefs. It doesn't even need to be about synchronicity, but they sort of say about something's being meant to be or whatever. And then I can ask them a little bit further about that. So it's more that when people acknowledge it, then I might invite them to have further conversation about it or mention my interest to them. But because I write about synchronicity in our local newspaper, I have a monthly column, and maybe 1 in 5 of those columns has a synchronicity kind of theme to it. So because that's more common knowledge, sometimes people get in touch in our practice. And quite frankly, the main new clients I see these days are, because I don't see many new clients, it's either because it's got a synchronicity background to it, or funnily enough, dissociative identity disorder, a very complex psychological condition that used to be called multiple personality disorder. My interest in trauma, which is a main specialty, PTSD and trauma, work with lots of war veterans. I work a bit in that area as well. So yeah, so people seek me out. Many people see our blog on Synchronicity, Enlightenment, or Psychosis. And so I find that people get in touch that way more directly, and so it's part of the conversation. But many people I see, and we don't talk about synchronicity much at all. Probably 80% of my clients probably don't. But if it comes up, there tends to be a very rich discussion, and it opens up other avenues and other kind of conversations, allowing for this intuitive side of life. And many clients find that so welcome. And I also go on research that suggests that years ago, I heard of this in 2004 by Nazu and Nazu. If a client has spiritual beliefs and the therapist asks them, "Do you have spiritual beliefs? Would you like to discuss them in our therapy sessions?" When that happens, they say, "Yep, I've got these beliefs and I would like to discuss them." It tends to help the person's recovery and progress in their presenting problem, even if the therapist is agnostic. So even if the therapist is agnostic, if they open up the opportunity for discussions about spiritual phenomena and the person's beliefs, they tend to make more progress on their depression or their trauma or whatever it is. Well, I think that applies also to people's interest in other intuitive forms of understanding, synchronicity, that side of things. So, yeah, and I think all of this helps something that Jung talked about, individuation, help us being more fully ourselves. And part of that is being a little less concerned about what other people think, including whether other people think that's a bit weird, that's a bit crazy to me. Hey, if it works for us, be prepared to back our experience, not just back our judgment, back our experience, that hopefully our judgment and our experience folds in together.
As we get close to the end of our very, very interesting discussion, Chris, I know, and I suppose you do, that as well, that there are some people who are overwhelmed by synchronicity. It doesn't mean that they're psychotic. They know that they're okay, but they have too many of them, and they're bothered by them. Don't know what they mean. I've had several people with whom I've done coincidence counseling, I call it, talking about how do you manage having all these coincidences, and what do they mean for you? I'm imagining that some people do find you in Geelong because you're Mr. Synchronicity there, and some of them are disturbed by having too many of them, at least for them. And I wonder how you approach such people.
Okay, one of the things is it's very important for all of us to stay grounded in different ways. If we find that we're potentially becoming a little bit more potentially chaotic or something like that, or our thoughts are getting more flighty or whatever, again, I think the more unconventional our ways of looking at things, the more we need to be grounded as well. Have grounding strategies. One of the ones for me is jogging regularly, some form of relaxation, could be meditation, mindfulness techniques, or how we use our leisure to be able to wind down. So have ways of regulating our energy levels in different ways. And if people are experiencing lots of coincidences too, maybe dialing it down a little bit to focus on one or two of the main things that they relate to. Don't try and interpret everything. That's getting caught up in what could be called illuminations. And people could get caught up in a problem of psychic inflation. Hey, I've got these special abilities and powers. Hey, half the world relates to this, and at least half the world always has. You're neither that weird nor that special to have these kind of experiences, but look to ground yourself, maybe focus on some of the main things and how they relate to your life story, and how you're going to practically looking to follow that through in rational terms as well. And I'd emphasize, have a spiritual friend or two if you can. Have other people you can relate to. People might do that joining a Jung society, or it might be a religious group, or other like-minded people that they know are interested in similar things. You only need one or two spiritual friends. And if people are feeling stressed in whatever way, see a mainstream mental health professional. Someone doesn't have to have an interest in synchronicity or spirituality to still help with grounding techniques, ways of managing stresses in everyday life. Like, fortunately, many of the things in my life were going well at that time when I, in a sense, had that experiment that eventually I was able to turn off within days, and intuitively an answer came for that. Now, other people, if people feel they don't have the resources they need, be open with some close friends or confidants. Have a spiritual friend is great, or look for one if you don't have one, but also be prepared to have some contact with mainstream mental health professionals, but also be prepared to say what your long beliefs have been. And you want that to be taken into account, even if you don't expect the therapist to understand or relate to that fully.
Well, that's wonderful advice, Chris. That's wonderful advice for our audience, particularly those who wonder about synchronicity and mental health. And you are, I'd say, one of the world's experts in this subject. And I very much appreciate your joining me to discuss this very, very important subject.
Thank you very much, Bernie. And as you'll appreciate, I found it was synchronistic that we had contact. And that's one of the little checking mechanisms through synchronicity. I thought later on, hey, now I relate to a psychiatrist expert, a mainstream expert, lots of work you've done on panic disorder. You're an academic psychiatrist and you're interested in synchronicity, and you seem to talk to me as though I'm not nuts. So I take that as a bit of an affirmation, and thank you, Bernie, for that.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram. cosmic consciousness.